So let's talk through the book of Mighty Nobles and Mech Suits with a review of Codex Imperial Knights for Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Knights with some new rules and detachments for one of the biggest and stompiest armies around. The Codex seems to have been delayed for mysterious reasons a couple of times, but now it's finally here, potentially the last Codex of 10th edition bar Drukhari, and giving a bunch of different ways to play the Imperial Knights with 3 new detachments and an updated, more standard index one. The Knights are certainly an army like no other in Warhammer 40k. Great big and stompy titanic vehicles with enormous amounts of raw power. They certainly seem to have been having an overly good time of it recently. Games Workshop did a digital update at the same time as the Chaos Codex came out, making a few tweaks to the knightly stat lines, though dropping their points cost by an enormous amount, sending Imperial Knights to perhaps one of the single strongest armies in the game, and winning a slightly crazy amount of tournaments before Games Workshop hit back with a few nerfs. As a result, I would be kind of surprised if the Imperial Knights Codex overall winds up settling as even stronger than it was before, though hopefully should be able to give a bit more variety and more interest to playing the faction with several different options and ways to play. If you're looking to pick up the Knights Codex or Knight Defender over the weekend, then the video sponsor Toy Snowman in Canada could help with that. They should have good stock of those at 15% off. I'll mention them more later. For anyone else looking to either pick up the book or the new models around the world though, the channel's affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description. Element Games in the UK have 15% off, Gap Games in Australia have 21%, Toy Snowman and Fenris have 10 to 15% off in Canada, Wargame Portal has 15% off Games Workshop prices in the USA, and Tash and Geldeep has somewhere between 16 and 20 in Germany and the EU. If you're watching this super early, then these are the times when the pre-orders go live, between Friday nights to Saturday morning, midnight Eastern Time in North America, and then between 10 and midday around the rest of the world. As ever, a big thank you to anyone using the channel affiliate links when they pick things up though. It does help to support Auspex Tactics. Let's get into the contents of the book though, and like other 40k codexes, there's the normal things here. There's lore and miniature galleries detailing the various knightly households, the different variants and classes of Imperial Knights, and showcasing what they can look like on the tabletop. There's crusade content for playing them in narrative play, and in this one there aren't any combat patrol rules for the Imperial Knights. Replacing that, there's an extended section on heraldry, though they do have a downloadable combat patrol rule set that came out in a White Dwarf. That's up on Warhammer Community, I believe. You just basically field 2 Armigers. For this review though, as usual, I'll be focusing on the core rules of the faction, as there's plenty to go into there. They've got the new army rule, the Code Chivalric, which has seen some tweaks with a little bit more interactivity than the old one. As the Imperial Knights operate rather differently, they've got other core rules for the super heavy walker movement rules, Bondsmen abilities to affect your Armigers, and also rules for adding in a Freebade ally to another Imperial army. In the book there's 4 different detachments, each with 4 enhancements and 6 stratagems. One's themed around Titanic Knights, one around the Armigers, one around Knights establishing a defensive line, and then a fairly fast moving new version of the Noble Lance. Then finally we've got the datasheets, most of these not really changed too much since the digital update where their stat lines all moved around. They include the new Knight Defender, the one with the shield generator and the conversion beamers, and the Forge World and Imperial Armour Knights still aren't within the book unfortunately, but they're still fully playable in the Imperial Armour download section of Warhammer Community. I'll talk over the points cost printed in the book in this one, though as we know Games Workshop will likely change these to some greater or lesser extent with their digital download for the army, which hopefully we'll have news on in the not too distant future. Jumping right into it though, let's start with the Code Chivalric. This one's the core army rule for the Imperial Knights, and in the index form it's just been a very easy and powerful rule to use, giving you essentially free rerolls and some command points if you can kill a warlord, and it still looks like if that's what you want from it, then it still will be the same. Games Workshop have rewritten it a bit, so there's maybe a little bit more choice and a few more trade-offs than there were before. It still basically has the same sort of format though. They have a quest which they call a Deed, and you try and do that to achieve a command point reward, and then you have a buffing rule called a Quality, and that's just basically a flat buff to your knight models of one sort or another, and in theory you could flex that out depending on the opponent as to which one you wanted. For both of these you can either pick one or 3 of them or determine them randomly. The command point reward has been very slightly changed. Previously it was usually just slay the warlord if you took the rerolls one, and if you destroyed the warlord then you get 3 command points as a reward. Now though you might not necessarily always get 3 command points, you only get 3 command points if you either chose to randomly determine either the quality or the Ds. If you picked both of them then it's slightly lessened and you only get 2 CP. I still probably say that even getting the 2 command points is probably good enough for a reward, and it probably just makes sense to choose the ones that you want unless you want to randomise for a bit of fun. The command point reward is handed out at the end of a turn in which the deed is completed, so I guess you don't have to wait until the start of your command phase this time, and then after that's done your army is said to be honoured, which does have a few impacts on some of the detachment rules, but not quite the big game changing boost to feel no pains that it had previously. The choice of the deeds and qualities are separate now, so there's no longer one mission tied to one deed. This is the list of deeds. There's 3 different options. As you can see, you can either determine randomly via the d6 table on the right, or just pick one. First up, Lay Low the Tyrants is still a similar sort of character slaying mission, though it's been a bit improved. It now no longer just has to be the enemy warlord. Instead, you select a single character model at the start of the battle, and your deed is considered complete at the end of the turn in which the character is destroyed. I guess that means that if there's a character that your opponent's almost certainly going to want to move forward with, then you could pick that one. I guess that's slightly improved, though there's still definitely going to be the counterplay of the opponent trying to keep that character model safe. Next up, Reclaim the Realm is holding objective markers, and the mission is to control more objective markers than the opponent at the end of their turn. So a lot of the time that's going to be essentially trying to hold 3 objectives out of 5 on the board, and this one seems like really quite a hard one. It'd be an easy mission if it could complete at the end of your turn, but it can't. So realistically, what might happen in any sort of somewhat balanced game is that your knights might move on to 3 objectives on your turn, and then the opponent has their turn to activate, maybe destroys a knight or contests a mid-board objective. There's a pretty reasonable chance that by the end of their turn they're going to be at least equaling you on objectives, which would mean you wouldn't be able to achieve this deed. I guess perhaps it could be doable if you really think that the opponent's going to have to really stay away from you in the early game and you are planning on playing aggressive. Finally, there's Reap a Great Tally. This one seems like the easier one to me, and the mission here is to destroy a number of units that's greater than equal to the current battle round number. So basically, if you've destroyed 2 units turn 1, you'd get it, or if you've killed 3 units by the end of turn 2, you'd get it, or 4 units on turn 3. Against the majority of enemy armies, that feels like one that you're just going to be able to complete just in passing while trying to destroy the enemy army. It just seems easier than the rest. The opponent might be able to play cagey and deny things early in the game, but that might mean that they're not contesting objectives or blocking your knight's movement or things, and that could have some value of its own. Seems like against the average opponent, that's going to pretty reliably get you honoured and getting your command points by maybe turn 2 or turn 3, and occasionally turn 1 if your opponent's got some exposed infiltrators or other units. Then for the other half of the core rule, there's the quality. This one's effectively the buff that your knights get throughout the game. Again, you can either choose them or you can roll randomly, and the names of them are maybe a bit annoyingly wordy, as they're sort of worded as the second half of an overall oath that you can swear, which I guess does have some fun factor that you can put together with the first half, but I suspect people are just going to be referring to them as either the movement boost one or the rerolls one. Speaking of which, the first one is with our Martial Valor risen overall, and that's the previous one which allows you to reroll 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll whenever your model's chosen to shoot and fight. As before, it's just an absolutely enormous damage increase. Knight profiles have got some seriously big hitting weapons, and a lot of the time that's almost going to be the equivalent of 2 extra shots with those weapons. It's very nasty in melee with big knight close combat weapons too. I guess that this one's still going to be the one that gets chosen the vast majority of the time. Next up, we've got And We're Eager for the Challenge. This one's the other fairly good one. It gives you plus 2 inch move to every single knight on the board, and also plus 1 to advance and charge. Again, that's really not unhelpful. Movement's a very big deal in Warhammer 40k, and perhaps particularly so for big titanic units that need to bring their weight to bear as soon as possible. It could even mean that with a command point reroll, you're odds on to make a charge out of reserve with, say, an Armored Warglaive or something. In particular, it looks like it'd combo really well with the Valourstrike Lance, which can allow you to advance and shoot and reroll advances. And it's also got its own big movement stratagem too. Between that, you could have some pretty seriously fast-moving knights to absolutely rush the enemy if it made sense to. So after initial rush things, its value might be a bit less over the course of the game. I still suspect that the damage ones might get taken the most, but it's definitely interesting for delivering knights to shooting or melee. Finally, the last one is Yet Our Legacy Be Unsullied. This one's an OC boost one, giving you plus 2 OC and plus 1 leadership. This one's not nothing, but not quite so good. The big knights went down to OC 8 for some reason. I kind of wonder if this might be why. Occasionally it might tip the difference between whether or not you hold an objective, or mean that the opponent has to move more things onto an objective to contest. It just doesn't really feel like it to give you much overall power towards actually winning the game though. Basically, with the existence of this and the harder to achieve options for the deeds, I'd just be tempted to pick both of them. Likely reaping a great tally on the first one, and then probably the damage rerolls on this one, unless that you think a massive knightly rush is going to be your best bet in this one, and the main thing that's going to determine the game is how fast you can bring your might to bear. Before we move on to other core knightly rules, I'll just give a quick shout out to Toy Snowman, the video sponsor. As mentioned earlier, they're a gaming store based in Montreal, Canada, active since 2019, and stock a good chunk of the 40k range, along with plenty of the Joy Toy figures. Their normal offering is to have Games Workshop models at 15% off Warhammer store prices, so definitely one of the better discount rates out there. Here's their store and their address if you happen to be local. If you live in Canada and are further away, here's the web store. Generally, I found it pretty easy to search and find the things that they have or don't have in stock. They do the normal discount retailer things that you'd expect. They've got a back order program where you can email them to ask them to order things in from Games Workshop so you can get the discount. free shipping over $150 and a loyalty reward scheme to get you just that little bit of extra discount if you log in and sign up for an account with them. They should be aiming to have some good stock of this week's releases, both Knight Codexes, the Knight Defender, and all the new Space Marine characters and combat patrols. As mentioned, I believe their pre-orders should be going live at midnight Eastern time. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one though. If you live in Canada, you can find them links down in the video description if you'd like to check them out. Getting on to the other core Imperial Knight rules though, and for the most part these haven't really changed. The Bondsmen abilities still buff the Armigers as opposed to the Big Knight. They're found on the Questoris and Cerastus pattern Knights, and the rule for them is that you nominate one Armiger within 12 inches, and then you get the buff applied to it as per the Knight. Some of these are really quite meaningful, like -1 damage or some big damage buffs for the Knightly Squire. Just given that you need to buy a model several times more expensive than the Armiger to activate them, it does mean they're maybe not really the focus of the majority of the detachments, even if they're not unhelpful. In this book, they're going to be far more meaningful in the Spearhead-at-Arms, where one Bondsman ability can affect 3 Armigers if you'd like to. For the big guys, they have the nightly movement rules of Super Heavy Walker. This one's unchanged from the updated version in their index. It means that any of the towering Titanic models can make normal advance or fallback moves through enemy models besides other Titanics, so stepping over monsters and vehicles and things, and they can move through terrain features that are less than 4 inches in height as if they weren't there. It does mean they might be able to get over certain screening units and not get tied up in combat, though they still have to actually end the move outside of engagement range, and that still means they can be screened to some extent if they've not got quite enough movements to get all the way to the other side with their big base and get an entire inch clear. With 40k terrain having quite so many big buildings around, this rule also acquired a second part as part of a balanced data slate. It was boosted to allow you to move straight through any terrain features regardless of height. If the knights happen to be smashing their way through big buildings and things, they just have to roll a dice, and on a 1 they get battle shocked automatically. It means the vast majority of time they should be absolutely fine, but battle shock in your own turn on a big knight could actually be really quite a big deal. It could stop you using powerful stratagems that you might want to, and it might stop you either contesting objectives or scoring secondaries that happened at the end of your turn. So if the dice gods are displeased with you, then your big knightly walker could have its plans messed with. You only find out if you're battle shocked after you've actually moved the knight to, so you can't find out and then decide where you're going. And bear in mind that this doesn't apply in the charge phase as well, so terrain features and enemy units will still screen you out there. Finally, for more core knight rules, you can still field them as before as Freeblade allies. In any Imperial army, you can either take 1 Titanic Imperial Knight or 3 Knight Armigers. That means that any Imperial army can call in a bit of big scary knightly muscle to help them out. But compared with fielding them in Codex Imperial Knights, they will be at a bit of a disadvantage. You won't have code Chivalric or any of the rerolls for it. You won't get any sort of core detachment rule to buff them, such as the advance and shoot from the Valourstrike lance, and you won't get any faction-specific stratagems or enhancements, so no rotating ion shields or things like that. It doesn't mean they can't still be good. Canis Rex often gets included in lists, given his damage and defensive power and discounted stratagems, and some factions use some Armigers for a good combination of some tough OC that can still deal some damage. For the most part though, it does keep allied knights as sort of niche, maybe something you can do a bit more for fun as opposed to in the most optimised lists around. Moving past the core rules though, let's talk detachments, and as mentioned the Imperial Knights have 4 of them. Their names are the Valourstrike Lance, Spearhead-at-Arms, Warden Lance, and the Questoris Companions. Valourstrike is basically a balanced and speedy one, kind of the successor of the index detachments, the Noble Lance, though a few important things have been traded out. Spearhead-at-Arms is the Armiger themed one, allowing big knights to use Bondsman abilities on 3 Armigers, and then stratagems that will affect all of those 3. The Warden Lance is one of the more unusual detachments in 40k. You basically draw a great big defensive line across the board, and while knights are on your defensive line, then they get some really powerful buffs and some really powerful stratagems, but not so much support besides that. Then finally the Questoris Companions are the Titanic Knight focused one. This one doubles down on the core rule, allowing you to unlock additional qualities. The enhancements are so cheap that they're almost free, and all the stratagem support is focused on the Titanic units only. You're still able to use the Questor Forge Pact, that's the Grotmus one for allying in AdMech, though unfortunately it really wasn't a particularly well designed one. For some reason lots of the stratagems are trying to make AdMech troops into damage dealers, which they just aren't really. And as with most detachments in 10th edition 40k, you can use all the Codex detachments in any of the detachments. Perhaps the only major difference is that Armigers are only battle line in the Spearhead one now. So it means that you can only take 3 Warglaves and 3 Helverins in the other ones, which is quite a big change. As ever though, some of the detachments just reward certain units better, so Armigers aren't going to have so much support in Questoris Companions, for example. Let's get into the detachments though, and let's start off with the Titanic one with the Questoris Companions. As mentioned, this one's focused on the big guys, the theme of it being a household of heroes, setting great goals and achieving them, and then moving flawlessly on to the next. The core rule for this one is called Heroes of Legend, and it plays into the core army mechanic. It doesn't have any effect until you've achieved your deeds mission, but once you have, as well as getting the command point reward, it also allows to determine an extra deed or quality. It sounds like for this one you can just select them, there's no real reason to roll randomly at this point. Essentially that's usually going to mean that you have either the rerolls or the speed boost active at the start of the game, and then you're trying to achieve your deeds to not only get the command point rerolls, but also unlock the other one, so you're going to wind up with some really quite fast and very dangerous knights quite quickly. Depending on the enemy, if you manage to get the destroying units one done early on, you can move on to destroying a character or taking the midfield objectives. For any subsequent deeds that you manage to do after your first, you generate an additional 1 command point. And I guess if you manage to do 2 deeds over the course of the game, you essentially get really buffed knights with rerolls, faster movement, and also the objective control boost. Overall, that really doesn't seem too bad, and particularly if your opponent is not careful with their units early in the game and allow you to destroy a lot of theirs early. If they do play super cagey though and stop you getting your first deed achieved until turn 3 or so, then I guess you would have been playing quite a lot of the game effectively without a detachment rule. For the stratagems, all of these are locked to Titanic units. For 1 command point, we've got Hero's Tread. At the end of your command phase, 1 Titanic model within a range of an objective marker can mark that point, and you basically have sticky objectives on that, and you have an OC of 5 to defend it, even if you move off it. This one feels like the Loyalist mirror of the Chaos Household Lords of Dread one. That's really quite a powerful sticky objective stratagem, making it a lot more playable to field an army of almost pure Titanics. It's really quite a big deal that certain utility enemy units just flat out won't be able to take objectives marked by that if they happen to have an OC of 5 or less. It's definitely a good source of strength for the detachment. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Moment of Glory. A Titanic Knight can consolidate 6 inches provided it ends an engagement range. It's handy enough to be able to tie up the next thing. Lots of things don't really want to be in close combat with knights. They probably don't want to tag anything too dangerous in melee with it, as they'll be hitting you essentially for free with that. If the opponent's on an objective, you might also be able to use it to get to an objective too, maybe flipping an objective in the process. For 2 command points, there's Unstoppable Warrior. This one's pricey, but allows a fallback shoot and charge for a Titanic Knight. Feels like at 2 command points it's maybe always going to be a little bit borderline, but it's a super powerful ability to have on a Titanic model. Perhaps for a mixed role knight fighting on the front lines, you could choose the combat that you want to be in, and perhaps reposition to fire any guns without the -1 to hit, and get lines of sight on the targets that you choose as a bonus. It's also going to be quite good for the ranged knights, maybe in particular the Knight Castellan. He can have a really bad time if he is tagged in melee by an enemy unit. Being able to fall back and fire all of those scary blast weapons into the unit that tried to tag him will be really quite a big deal as well. Certainly a really strong one, but also pricey at 2 command points. You wouldn't want to use that every turn. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Courageous Stand. This one gives you a 6+ feel no pain against shooting for 1 Titanic Knight. It's not a bad defensive buff, though it isn't generally going to be quite as strong as Rotate Ion Shields. A 6+ feel no pain is effectively a plus 20% durability increase on average. So if you had, say, a 26 wound knight that was out in the open and just about to get absolutely lit up, your opponent would on average need to chew through around about another 5 wounds of knight if they wanted to destroy it in 1 turn. Maybe that could be enough to stop them doing so. It's definitely not unusable, but not quite as auto-use as Rotate Ion Shields often is. For 1 command point, there's a big damage dealer called Titanic Duel. Again, it's limited to Titanic models, and they get a big +1 to hit and wound against a Titanic monster or walker unit. That one's just a spectacular damage increase, which probably makes sense to trigger it as often as possible if you've got meaningful targets to attack against. Pretty spectacular that you can use that on a Titanic Knight. It's just going to be a little bit limited in targets. If the opponent does have some meaningful monsters, walkers, or Titanic models, and that's all well and good, though it won't help you damage more standard battle tanks or say elite infantry in 40k. It means that this detachment might be weirdly good at killing certain armies of heavies, but not quite so stand out against others. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Driven by the Past. This one allows advance and charge for 1 Titanic Knight for 1 CP, and that's a pretty excellent one to have access to. The difference between a scary Titanic Knight making a charge or not is going to be a really big deal. And I guess in this detachment you've got a better chance of actually having the movement buff active from the Code Chivalric. For that one you could have a +2 to your movement, a +1 to advance and charge, and then also advancing and charging at the same time. If you do have both that deed active and also this stratagem, then say a Knight Lancer has an average charge threat range of around 29 inches, which is just kind of crazy. They're almost certainly going to be able to get into units that the opponent really doesn't want them to, unless they're well screened behind enemy lines. Then finally moving on to enhancements for the detachment. These ones seem to work a bit differently to most of them out there. First up, they seem to be really cheap. They're printed at 5 points each in the Codex, so I guess the idea is that the Titanic Knights get a nice feels good boost. There's more sort of a flat buff than having a meaningful points cost. The other thing is that they're all once per game abilities, but if you happen to achieve a deed, then they get reset. So say if you activated one of these once per game, and use the ability, and then later in the game you achieve one of the deeds, then you'd be able to use that enhancement once more. They're all 5 points, and going through them, first up there's Herald of Triumph. This one's a once per game battle shock at -1 for every enemy unit in engagement range of the model, just after you've made a charge move. This one's pretty niche and probably going to be secondary to most of the others. Again, not awful for 5 points though. Occasionally it could stop your opponents doing a defensive stratagem or contesting certain secondaries. Looking far better is the Pennant of Silver Fury. This one's a once per game, very meaningful melee damage buff, getting sustained hits too to the bearer's melee weapons. That's excellent on just about any knight out there. If you had a knight hitting on a 3+, it's effectively a plus 50% damage. That will be pretty swingy depending on the amount of 6s that you actually manage to roll. That seems utterly spectacular for 5 points, and more so if you even have the chance to be able to do it more than once. Seems auto-include to me. And as mentioned, it's going to be very hard to stop certain melee knights from getting into combat with that advance and charge. Next up, we've got Wormslayer Divination for 5 points. It allows the Titanic Knights to reroll hit rolls in the shooting phase against a unit that can fly, and then as with the rest, the enhancements are expended unless you achieve a D's. A bit specific, but given that it's almost free at 5 points, again seems basically auto-include if you have a Castellan Crusader or Defender. It won't be relevant against every army, though against certain flying foes that's going to be an absolute monstrous increase in damage, and potentially more than once a game. Finally, for 5 points, we've got Crushing Condemnation. And this one's kind of harking back to when you could deal some damage for killing an enemy tank and then throwing it at something else. Essentially, after you've killed an enemy in melee, you choose one enemy unit within 12 inches and you roll 6d6. For each 4+, the enemy takes a mortal wound. Again, if it remains 5 points, then it's kind of in why not territory for a melee knight. Probably not one to plan around in a crazy big way. But on a good day, you could have your Knight Gallant or Lancer just charge in and obliterate one enemy unit, and then throw this to go splat against a few infantry models nearby if you've got a good target. Overall, between all that, it feels like there's quite a lot of things to like about the detachment. The army rule maybe feels a bit swingy depending on whether or not you can achieve deeds easily or not. Definitely solid enough though, and I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that you might well do so with the kill tally one on turn 2. And plenty of the stratagems do seem like they're really quite good support as well. The sticky OC5 one is great. Advance and Charge is a pretty nice value one. The +1 to hit and wound one is enormous power if you're against the right foe, and enhancements all seem like basically added value that you'd want to have around. In particular, the melee damage one seems like a particular standout, though the rest are all fine given that they're near enough free. Overall seems like a solid enough detachment to me, though maybe does feel like it's got a number of things that are just going to be very opponent dependent, both depending on their exact army and how they choose to play. Next up, let's move on to one of the more weird and creative detachments in the Gate Warden lands. This one's a more balanced one with some things for Titanics and Armigers. It's trying to play into the theme of Imperial Knights as defenders of the Imperial realm, having a pretty unusual core mechanic in drawing a great line across the battlefield, and that's your defense line, and then a lot of your buffs and synergies are locked to that. That core rule is called Dauntless Defenders, and to draw that line in the first place, you select 2 objective markers to be your foundations at the start of the game, and the imaginary line that's drawn between them is your defensive line. While that defensive line crosses one of your knight's bases, it's said to be on your defensive line, or affecting the whole for the great big knights that don't have bases like the Acastus ones. The core buff is quite a solid one, while on your defensive line you get to ignore all hit roll modifiers and gain the Sustained Hits 1 special rule. It applies to both range and melee attacks, though the target must be visible to you. They also have a rule that if some mission rule means that one of the objectives disappears, then you get to nominate a new foundation. Thinking about how to use this is really quite interesting. It means that you could maybe connect your home objective to perhaps your safer expansion objective. That could mean that you could have some serious firepower on the line, and if the opponent tries to push up and try and take it away, then you can hit them back with some enormous firepower. Or alternatively, you could maybe have it sort of going across the midboard, connecting the 2 furthest midboard objectives to each other. And then it means that the knights in your own deployment zone wouldn't benefit, but if you push up aggressively to try and take the midfield, then your knights are going to get access to some pretty easy buffs. I feel like the position restriction is going to be particularly painful for Imperial Knights though. It's not like they have absolutely loads of units, so those units need to be in the right places to deal damage to enemies. I feel like often you're going to have the choice between whether you stay on the defensive line, or say get a better line of sight, or remain safer from the enemy fight back. So while the buffs are powerful, it's going to have trade-offs, and the opponent could definitely make that harder for you if they wanted, maybe trying to keep their units hidden from models that could position themselves on your defensive line, or arrange themselves so that if you want to charge them, you might find it harder to get those benefits. Sustained hits is a nice solid damage boost though, and the hit roll modifiers might be a bit more opponent dependent, though could help out with things like big guns never tire and shooting in melee, or bracketed knights that have taken a lot of damage. For the stratagems, quite a lot of them are locked to the defensive line as well, and while most of them are fairly powerful, again that definitely comes with downsides. If you either can't reach it or venture beyond it, then your knights get just a lot worse in general. First up, for 1 command point, there's Lancebreaker. This one's a -1 to wound in melee against a knight on your defensive line. It only works on enemies where their strength is greater than your toughness, and there's quite a lot of melee units in 40k that have more sort of mid-strength and rely on lethal hits or volume attacks to punch up a bit. Feels like that one's going to be a bit niche, both with positioning requirements and only affecting certain enemy melee. Drive them out for 1 command point gives you critical hits on a 5+ against an enemy unit that's on your defensive line. I guess that could be handy enough if you draw a line that transects the entire mid-board, but given it's going to be a fairly thin line, it might be fairly doable for opponents to be just off it, so they could still be taking objectives on your foundation one and not necessarily be on the defensive line. Occasionally it might happen though, and it means that you could hit them back with sustained hits extra hard. Incidentally, it looks like the defensive line would essentially be a sort of 40mm wide one, as it sounds like you can draw from any part of one of the objectives to any part of one of the others, so you're essentially getting a small area that's a bit more than 1 inch wide. For 1 command point, there's Titanic Bombardment. A Titanic Knight that remains stationary on defensive line gets sustained hits too. I guess that's extra incentive for big shooty knights to get there, fire very hard when they've got sustained hits, and then potentially if they're able just to remain in place and still have good targets the next turn, you could think about doubling down with this one. It's maybe not quite as big a damage increase as it sounds, given that you'd already have the sustained hits one just from the defensive line rule in the first place, so you're only increasing by a small amount and not necessarily by loads. At least in theory land though, if the opponent, say, engaged a knight in melee and he wanted to shoot them back extra hard within engagement range, you could use both this and drive them out together. So sustained hits 2 going off on a 5+, if the opponent allows you to use that, then that's a pretty brutal combo. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Marshal the Defense. This one's the only one that isn't locked to a defensive line in some way, and handily enough it is genuinely a really good one. 2 knights anywhere on the board get +3 inches to their movement. That's really quite a powerful movement boost. In effect, it's really not so very different from 2 knights getting advanced shoot and charge, which is a really big stratagem. Just rather than having the random advance roll, it automatically goes off on a mid-value 3, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world for a bit of reliability. You might not get big 6 results, but at the same time you're not going to be left flat-footed and roll a 1. It's really quite powerful and very efficient indeed, as it affects 2 different knights, nice enough for slower firepower ones to lumber around the board and get line of sight, maybe even reach your defensive line if you're trying to rush up to the mid-board, and again could allow a very long charge threat range with a more melee-orientated knight. A Knight Lancer would be averaging a 24-inch charge with this, going up to more like a 27 or 28 if you happen to be using the movement oath. Overall, this one's just a really solid stratagem, and seems like a reasonable one that you could get value on turn. For 1 command point, there's Steadfast Superiority. You get to reroll hit rolls in melee for a knight on your defensive line. Again, that's going to be really opponent dependent as to whether or not they let you charge things there. It could allow you to counter-attack if they're charging you, or be alright if you're using the defensive line in the mid-board. And then finally, for 1 command point, there's Fortress of Intimidation. This one's a bit more of a niche as a battle shock one. If the enemy tries to charge a knight on your defensive line, then they have to take a battle shock test at -1 to the test for each unit that tries to charge your knight, and that could mean that if they fail, they might not be able to re-roll the charge or use any aggressive stratagems in melee. As with battle shock, it's always going to be unreliable. There's a pretty good chance that they just pass it, but for an absolutely critical enemy unit that's charging at a sort of mid-range, it could be really powerful. A low chance to prevent a melee, and also doesn't help with their damage dealing if they wanted to use a strat. Finally, we've got the Enhancements. Acquisitor-at-Arms can give you a big surge to the objective control of an Armiger. Usually they're objective control 6 now. If the bearer's on your defensive line and there's no enemy units on your defensive line, you get to add your bearer's objective control to the Armiger when you use the Bondsmen ability on them. So that normally means that you'd have a 14 OC Armiger moving around there. Really quite strong on an objective until the opponents put something on that line. Though I guess if they do choose to, then it might give you the chance of using that stratagem to hit them back hard. Next up, printed at 20 points, there's Vengeful Tread. This one gives you a 0 CP tank shock once per turn, basically using the Knight Lancer's ability but making it generalised to any knight that you might want. For 20 points, that seems a pretty reasonable increase in value. Usually an extra 3 or 4 mortal wounds on the charge. It doesn't allow you to use any sort of extra copies of it, so I guess it's just use it here and it's free, and then you can't use it again, so that's going to be a solid help out to any melee knight. Next, printed at 20 points, there's Augury Halo. This one gives you ignored cover while on your defensive line. This one seems borderline auto-include, given that the easiest way to get value out of the defensive line seems like a big shooty knight. Just laying down Masters of Firepower there. Seems really nice for a Crusader, Defender or Castellan. A Knight Crusader with an Avenger Gatling Cannon and a Rapid-Fire Battle Cannon seems great there. Moving up to the defensive line, getting their sustained hits 1, ignoring modifiers and ignoring cover. That's a lot of reliable firepower. Then finally there's Purgation's Hand, which is printed at 10 points. This one allows you to reroll hits and wounds of 1 in melee, provided your model is on your defensive line. Really quite a solid damage increase there, though I guess it might have some overlap with your inbuilt knightly rerolls if you choose those from the Oath. I feel like the position isn't going to be super ideal for that one, given that it basically means that you're counter-attacking a bit. It could be okay as a points filler though. Overall, I must admit I'm a bit unsure as to what to make of this one. It's just an interesting combo of some really quite powerful damage and defensive buffs, but having them really quite painfully positioning locked. And it means that potentially moving your knights out of position as you go about doing your thing is going to have some big downsides if you do want to reap the rewards. Certainly seems pretty scary for firepower knights though, and I must admit the only stratagem that isn't defense line locked with the extra 3-inch movement one seems really quite a solid one for one command point when it affects 2 knights at once. Just due to the work needed to get the buffs, I'd be kind of surprised if this starts taking over as one of the strongest ways to play knights, but it certainly has some interesting stuff and feels fun to have a detachment that works quite differently to most of the other things that we've seen before. Next up we've got the Valourstrike Lance, which is essentially the updated Noble Lance from the Index, and as a result it's a fairly well balanced one, both applicable to the big knights and the Armigers. From the Index, this one has lost its Feel No Pain style rule, which is really quite a big deal as it basically gave every knight on the board effectively a plus 20% health increase, with the potential for a whole load more if you happen to achieve your deed and slay the enemy warlord for a 5+ Feel No Pain. That's gone away though, and interestingly enough they've decided to change it around for a core rule called Bold Gallantry, which basically makes this knight army a really fast one, maybe similar to House Raven style in the past. Your entire army gets to reroll advances, and you get the assault keyword on guns when advancing. So it means that every one of your knights should have a pretty reliable extra 3 or 4 inches of movement or so if they just want to run around, move to objectives and shoot, and they don't want to charge. Feels like the core rule is going to more heavily reward ranged knights versus melee. For the stratagems, compared with the Noble Lance, they've lost some really quite powerful abilities. They don't have fights on death anymore, which was quite a big one for Titanic Knights. They no longer have the one for +1 to wound monsters and vehicles, and they don't have Squire's Duty anymore, which again was a very good one, allowing super efficient focus fire from Helverins. They have got some genuinely good options as trade-offs though. For one command point, there's Run Them Through. This one allows up to 3 knights that charge this turn to gain the Lance keyword. As with a few stratagems in this detachment, you nominate 1 point on the board, and it can affect up to 3 knights within 9 inches of that point, so potentially knights over quite a wide front in the game, essentially 18 inches apart base to base. The Lance buff definitely isn't a terrible one if you want to take out some tough monsters and vehicles. I guess you could have multiple Armigers affected by it. A fair bit of the time Imperial Knights are going to be wounding on a 3 or a 2 though, and going from a 3 to a 2+ isn't quite as big of a change as some of the other wound bracket changes. It maybe just feels a tiny bit less likely that you're going to be charging things all the way down a battle line rather than just knights in isolation, but overall it still feels like a fairly solid melee buff against the right targets. Next up, Thunderstomp is a melee one for knights that are covered in guns. If you're attacking with armoured feats like Helverins, then they go up to 8 attacks, or if you've got Titanic feats like the Crusader, the Dominus Knights and the Defender, they'll go up to 12 attacks and they'll all gain an extra 1 AP. That means for the big stompy knights you'll have 12 attacks at Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 2, all hitting on a 4+. That should be enough to tip the balance between doing just a tiny bit of chip damage to actually meaningfully stomping down some lighter infantry units out there. And it could be a pretty big deal, particularly if it stops your knight from being locked up next turn if you manage to destroy a lighter enemy unit that tagged you, so you can then go moving, advancing and shooting something else. Next up, for a big pricey 2 CP, there's Full Tilt. This one again is really quite a fun movement buff. +2 to move and +2 to advance rolls for up to 3 knights within the 9-inch range. So if you do have knights that are running and gunning using the Detachment Advance rule, that's basically going to be a straight +4 movement. It means for a Questoris Knights you could probably expect to move around about 18 inches and still fire. For a Cerastus like an Atropos, you could move a big 20 inches and still fire provided you roll okay on the advance. That's really quite a big deal for being able to just zoom around the board, get to objectives and get line of sights on things that might well be safe. And I guess in theory land you could stack the combo super high with the army rule as well, getting a +2 to move and +1 to advance there. I guess that increases those theoretical movement ranges to 21 inches or so, and up to about 23 inches or so for an Atropos. For armies that are going to rely on just hiding from Imperial Knights all game, that could be super scary. This one really is quite a big expensive stratagem though. At 2 command points, unless you have Canis Rex on the board, you can't use this turn 1. It's going to be far more borderline value if you're only using it effectively on 1 knight and you don't have multiple knights that really need it. Next up, for 1 command point, there's a surprisingly high yield one in Vow of Retribution. Again, this is one of the ones to nominate a point on the board, and then ranged weapons for up to 3 knights within 9 inches of that suddenly get lethal hits on all of their ranged weapons. How good it is might depend on the actual knight chassis that you're using. If you're already wounding on a 3 or a 2+, lethal hits doesn't have quite so much crazy value, but for anything that you are wounding on a 4+ or a 5+, it's going to be pretty massively standout. Any Gatling cannons are certainly going to love that on the Knight Crusader or the Knight Warden. It's be really quite good for the Knight Defender as well, with a sort of mid-strength plasma and the critical hits that can go off on a 4+ on the conversion beam. But it's just pretty massive that this can scale quite so well. Even using it just on one Knight Crusader with an Avenger Gatling cannon wounding on a 5+ is probably going to be worth it then and there. Never mind if you could affect 2 more that are using the same sort of thing. All in all, that's a pretty brutal damage buff, a really easy one that you could use turn on turn, and could be a good incentive to taking knights with Avenger Gatling cannons in this detachment. For one command point, there's a surprise reactive move here with Tactical Foil. This is one of the fairly standard ones where if the enemy moves within 9 inches of one of your knights, you get to reactive move d6 inches in their movement phase. Given that it's not a flat number, it's not going to be a reliable reactive move. You could still use this and then just get 1 inches and it might not change anything. But just occasionally it could be super meaningful. Say if the opponent wants to charge your knight and they move up to say 7 inches away, if you move d6 inches back, then that charge is odds on to fail, which is absolutely massive for a Titanic knight. And it could also just effectively turn off shooting in the shooting phase occasionally. Say you've got a big ranged knight that's just lit up a bunch of enemy units, if they decide to both push up the board near it and also move their other units around to gain lines of sight on it, you might just be able to shimmy around a ruin a bit to break some lines of sight. It could give you some good incentive just to have them only just tipping out of terrain as well, so even 1 inches will make the difference between them being behind a ruin rather than just within it. Overall, between all that, it's pretty enormous for a Titanic knight. Maybe not particularly useful literally every time that you can trigger it, but on the odd occasion where it basically means that your knight doesn't take a huge amount of damage, it's going to be more than worth it. Finally, for one command point, there's Rotate Ion Shields, the old reliable 4+ invulnerable saves against ranged attacks. Again, just super easy to get value out of. If the opponent starts to commit to gunning down one of your biggest and most exposed knights, then use this and hopefully bounce a whole bunch of high AP anti-tank fire off them. You could present really quite an intimidating wall of 4+ invulnerable saves at range in this codex as well, given the Knight Defender gets one at base. Even if they aren't shielding other knights for that special rule, you could have another Titanic one that's exposed and then just use this if it's threatened, and no matter where their opponent shoots, they're slogging through a 4+ invulnerable. Overall, they've certainly lost some powerful stratagems, but they've gained some really strong options as well. Then for their enhancements, again they've traded off some good ones, but these are all also pretty interesting, and again they're all enhancements of a theme. They basically have a buff that you can either apply to the knight itself, or one other knight within 12 inches. They've certainly made trade-offs here though, given that the previous Noble Lance enhancements were quite so good. Sticky objectives was just really handy to have in a knight army. The big teleport redeployer knight was an absolute power move alongside something like a Castellan or Crusader, just warping around the board to get a near guaranteed alpha strike on the target that they most want to. The ones that replaced them do add some reliable extra value though. First up there's the Bearer of the Iron Chalice, which is printed at 25 points. This one's a healing one, but quite a flexible one. At the end of the movement phase, one knight model within 12 inches invisible regains D3 lost wounds, or 3 of the Armigers' honours. Healing ones often feel a bit underwhelming if they have to apply to the bearer themselves, but given the flexibility here, it feels like you probably have a solid chance of being able to activate that multiple times over the course of the game, and potentially with a fair few wounds of knight restored. Bearer of the Judicant's Helm is printed at 25 points. At the start of your shooting phase, one unit within 12 inches invisible of the bearer can ignore cover. Again, pretty handy for the majority of ranged knights out there, but maybe the most obvious choice feels like it could be a Battle Cannon Gatling Cannon Crusader. The low AP on their weapons is the exact sort of thing that you want ignore cover on. The detachment makes it super easy to get lines of sight, and the lethal hit stratagem is a pretty massive value add to that one. Next up, there's Bearer of the Lancer's Sigil, printed at 25 points. This one's the same rule for choosing a unit within 12 inches, this time at the start of a charge phase. And the one that you chose can reroll charge rolls. Feels like with the coordination needed, that's going to be most helpful from the bearer itself, which definitely isn't awful, but nothing that a command point can't do as well. I feel like for 25 points, that one's a lot more take or leave. Finally, we've got the Bearer of the Evanescent Ion. That one's printed at 15 points, and again I say this one's really quite a solid one. At the end of your movement phase, you select one knight model within 12 inches, and it gains the stealth ability until the start of your next movement phase. Again, that's really quite a solid defensive one against enemy ranged armies. It means that you could have a knight with -1 to hit and a 4+ invulnerable save from Rotate Ion Shields, so pretty solid insurance against losing the knight, though given that you have to use this in your own movement phase, it won't protect the bearer against alpha strikes in your turn 1. Overall, compared with the Noble Lance, it's definitely made some trade-offs, though has some seriously scary stuff here to compensate. Fast-moving knights gaining line of sight is a really big advantage, even if you do lose the Feel No Pain. You could potentially go for a massive mass power move with some really big movement if you wanted to. For ranged knights trying to skirmish with the enemy, the tactical foil seems potentially amazing for one command point. If it ever manages to basically save the life of a Titanic Knight, that's going to be a huge deal. Rotate Ion Shields is something the other detachments get, so it's a solid draw there, and that Vow of Retribution for the mass lethal hits just seems weirdly powerful for 1 command point when you can get a genuinely good buff on well over 1,000 points of models just for 1 CP. The enhancements maybe feel a little bit less game changing, but for having 1 big Titanic Knight permanently ignoring cover and 1 always having stealth, both of those do seem nice as well. Overall feels like this one's going to be a strong one. Finally, for the mainline knightly detachments, we've got the Spearhead-at-Arms, and this one's the one that's themed around the Knight Armigers. Generally in this one you're going to want to have a good amount of these, but backed up by Titanic Knights to use Bondsmen abilities on them. I guess at 2,000 points, maybe say 2 big Knights and the rest Armigers might be a good balance. The detachment makes Armigers battle lines, so you can have up to 6 Helverins, Warglaves and Moirax. Elsewhere in the Codex they're not going to be battle line though, as mentioned, so if you want lots of small squires on the board then this is the detachment to go for. The core rule for the detachment makes the Bondsman abilities just far more meaningful, allowing you to affect 3 Knight Armigers rather than 1, and that means that the choice of the big Knight for the Bondsman abilities is just going to be a lot bigger and more important a part of it, particularly when the Bondsman abilities are pretty meaningful. You could be getting -1 damage, or various powerful damage boosts of different sorts. You could say have tough Armiger Warglaves moving out into the mid-board and being hard to kill, and quite a lot of different ways to make Armiger Helverins into a more scary shooting battery. If you happen to have achieved your deed and got honoured, then you get a 15-inch range on the Bondsman abilities rather than the normal 12 as well, so it could just have a little bit of quality of life flexibility later in the game. Going through the stratagems, and again they're rather themed, the vast majority of them can either affect 1 Knight Armiger, or all of the Knight Armigers that are affected by a single Knight's Bondsman ability, so you could have them apply to 3 Armigers if you have a Titanic Knight to lead them. First up, you can nominate an enemy unit, and your Armigers get a +1 to hit that unit in the fight phase. I guess a lot of the time that would be an Armiger Warglaive with 5 attacks on the charge hitting on a 2+, maybe 2 of them side by side if it makes sense to. It's not nothing, but doesn't really feel like the biggest, most meaningful damage buff in the world. Kind of feels like a bit of a wash versus tank shock. For 1 command point, there's Thin Their Ranks. This one gives the Armiger models and ranged weapons rapid fire 1, and once again can apply to multiple Armiger units. It's probably most obviously useful on the Helverins, as I guess if you had 3 of them buffed, then you could have an extra 6 autocannon shots on the go between the lot of them, which seems reasonable enough for 1 command point. If you do have a Warglaive super close though, and the melter fire is genuinely going to be a big deal, it would mean that you essentially get 2 more melter shots out of them if they're less than 6 inches away. Again, I feel like that could well be worth it if you've got a fairly ideal target, that leads to the death of another Space Marine Elite Infantry or something. For 1 command point, there's Exemplar's Wisdom. 1 Titanic Knight shoots at a target in the shooting phase, and then until the end of the phase, any Armigers that are affected by its Bondsman ability gain AP -1 against the same target. Again, this one seems like it's got some really obvious synergy with Helverins. Perhaps their biggest weakness for the autocannons is having very low AP on them. And say if you had this applied to a Knight Warden, then you could have a whole bunch of Helverins ignoring cover and getting sustained hits from its Bondsman ability, and then also getting an extra AP -1, so they're AP2. And you could even stack things further with one of the enhancements, or even double up with Thin Their Ranks for 2 CP. You would need to have the Warden actually shoot the target that they're going to, though I guess you could put a secondary weapon into it. It does mean that if you stack all the buffs though, that could be a pretty ferocious little gun battery. For 2 command points you could have 3 Helverins spitting out 30 autocannon shots at strength 9, AP2 and damage 3 with sustained hits and ignores cover, and also still being able to use the single nightly rerolls as well. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Let Duty Be Your Shield, and this one's sort of like Armour of Contempt for a single Armiger in the shooting phase. This one can't affect multiple ones. The balanced data slate still nerfs Armour of Contempt, so it's only going to be useful against 1 unit's attacks. I guess if your Armiger just desperately needs to survive and it's shot by something that's got AP2, you could reduce that to AP1, and it could potentially stack with cover as well, where to be even more effective. It's not going to be as meaningful against big, really high AP things like melter weapons though. It doesn't seem quite as nice as Rotate Ion Shields, particularly as you can't use it on Titanic Knights, and you would want to keep them alive while they're buffing things in this detachment. Next up, we've got Mantle of the Mentor. This allows an Armiger to fall back and shoot. Again, applies to multiple if lots are affected by 1 model's Bondsman things. Generally useful to access for just about any big stompy vehicle list, particularly if you want to drop back from say an enemy infantry unit and then light it up with other things. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Squires of the Hunt, and this one's a Return to Reserve style one. An Armiger model within 9 inches of a board edge returns to strategic reserves at the end of the enemy fight phase. And again, you could do this en masse if you had a bunch of them affected by 1 Bondsman. Return to Reserves is generally going to be handy to have late game in 40k, giving you a lot more options to push on the enemy, and could be useful if you say no that a Helverin or 2 isn't going to have a good shooting target next turn, so you could basically redeploy them to get one. I guess you would turn up after Bondsman abilities have happened though the next turn, so it might stop them from using particularly efficient stratagems in the next turn. Finally, for the Spearhead-at-Arms, we have the Enhancements, and literally all of these apply to Titanic Knights and only come into effect while there's 2 or more Armigers affected by the model's Bondsman abilities. The first one perhaps seems like the easiest one to get good use out of. It's Mentor's Pride. It costs 20 points. While you've got 2 or more bonded Armigers, those Armigers get 2 reroll hit rolls of 1. Hard to go too far wrong with there, and yet another thing to throw into the big damage stack. I guess that's yet another set of buffs that you can apply to Armiger Helverins if you wanted them in a gun battery. Perhaps if buffed by Crusader, Warden or Paladin. Next up for 10 points there's Fables of Nightmare that can hand out precision to an Armiger's melee weapons, so I guess best for Warglaves charging into the fight while affected by Bondsman abilities. It's not nothing but also not necessarily the easiest to coordinate and only useful against some foes. It feels a bit passable to me, even if it is kind of cheap. Could be a points filler I guess. Next up for 15 points there's Martial Tuition. Again, it works while there's multiple Armiger models under the effects of the Bondsman abilities, and this phase one of them is allowed to use the counter-offensive stratagem for 0 CP. I guess that means that you might have the odd Warglaive interrupting when it gets charged. Could be alright maybe if you're giving a Warglaive -1 damage and sending it off to the midboard to try and survive on a central objective. Given that your opponent would know that you have this coming though, there's a good chance they might just act with the unit that's charged them first. They'll still have the chance to make the first combat happen. I guess not unhelpful to have as a side benefit if it's a points filler, though not quite as useful to get reliable value out of. Finally for 10 points there's Tales of Heroism. This one allows your bonded Armigers to ignore any or all modifiers to the hit roll and wound roll, but again it's only locked to melee. I feel like it would be a lot more useful if you could use that at range as well, making a Helverin gun battery a bit more reliable. I guess it doesn't hurt if any of your Armigers wind up getting bracketed or the opponent's got some sort of -1 to hit in melee. It's going to be quite opponent dependent though, and a lot of the time it's just going to be a 10-point upgrade that doesn't really do anything. Overall, for this one I feel like it does genuinely have some interesting stuff. The core rule certainly means that Bondsman abilities go way further and adds a lot of value there. It does perhaps seem to me that the single scariest thing is a great big squadron of Helverins with some serious firepower buffs. Useful things both from Bondsman abilities, 2 of the Stratagems and 1 of the Enhancements as well. I guess you could have 2 similar formations, each around a Titanic Knight, and then some Warglaives to charge into the midboard. At the same time, it does have really quite a lot of points in setup, and if you do either lose the big knight or say a couple of the Armigers, or synergies break down in quite a big way and things become quite a lot less effective. So it feels like there's a pretty reasonable chance that you might not have your damage combos firing at full efficiency for too much of the game. It does feel like there's enough to be interesting here though. Having lots of sort of medium threat, medium OC models is generally quite good for the objective game and unit trading and things. Overall, it's certainly interesting to see some new detachments and themes for the Imperial Knights. I feel like Games Workshop have done well enough to make the vast majority of the Knight detachments at least somewhat interesting. They do have genuine draws and strengths to them. I feel like if I had to guess the strongest at the moment, I'd probably say the sort of Valourstrike Lance, Noble Lance successor. Between things like the lethal hit stratagem, the reactive move and access to rotate ion shields, that just seems like it's got a lot of good strength. Plus movement's really important for Knights. All the rest have some good stuff though. Advance and Charge and Sticky Objectives 5 are both really big deals for the Questoris Companions one, and have got good value from their detachment rule and enhancements too. The Gate Warden Lance has an awkward mix of some of the strongest damage buffs, but being really quite location locked. I do like their movement stratagem though, and the Spearhead one certainly looks like it's got some scary stuff for Helverins, and might be good for playing the mission with so many units moving around. Will be interesting to see what people make of them when they put Army List on the tabletop. I look forward to talking through a few of them on the channel. I'll be interested to hear which one you want to try though. Moving on to the other half of the codex though, let's talk through the datasheets. The Imperial Knight codex still doesn't have a vast amount of datasheets, only really being represented by 3 mainline model kits, even if there is a variant to the Questoris one now. And for unit changes, the only update into the new codex is adding in the Knight Defender. That means for Questoris variants we've got the mixed role ones with the Errant Paladin, Warden Preceptor and Canis Rex, the melee dedicated Gallant, and then the range dedicated Crusader and Defender. For the big shooty Dominus Knights, we've got the Castellan and Valiant, and for Armigers, we've got the Armiger Helverin and Armiger Warglaive. They'll still be able to access all the ones from the Imperial Armour Compendium, so 4 Cerastus Knights there, the variant Armiger Moirax, 2 Questoris ones, and 2 Big Acastus. In particular, some of the Cerastus Knights have been pretty strong in 10th edition, the Atropos and the Lancer have been fairly standout. Otherwise, you can also buy in allies from the Imperial Agents too, and that tends to be at least a fairly popular choice for Imperial Knights. Lone Operatives can be quite good to do some secondary objectives and not have to commit, say, 140 points or so to an objective with an Armiger. The Callous Assassin is really nice for bouncing on and off the board doing those. Some Sisters of Battle tend to be a fairly popular choice, often broken in half with an Immolator, so you've got multiple small units for sticky objectives. And perhaps a cheap Collector's Assassin is one of the more commonly used ones too. Before we get into the datasheets, I just mentioned that printed points aren't final. I will talk through them as they maybe give us a little bit of an idea as to what Games Workshop's thinking, and they do seem to be kind of similar to the points that we had pre-Codex. I just bear in mind though that Games Workshop will eventually issue a digital update for this one. I'm sure further ones in the future. Earlier in 10th edition we had the combat engineers jump from 35 points up to 70 points in the Guard Codex, just showing quite how different some of the points changes can be occasionally. In any case, I'll certainly talk through the points changes when we get them here on the channel. For the Knights, let's start with the new Defender one, and then go through the Armigers, then Questoris, then Dominus in turn. The Knight Defender is the kind of somewhat new Knight for 10th edition 40k, basically made with an additional sprue put into the Questoris kit, swapping out the Canis Rex sprue with the Las Impulsor and Sir Hector. It looks like the Questoris Knight is going to be available from discount retailers, and Canis Rex might be a bit more expensive given that he's online only. You can still build all of the Warden, Gallant and Crusader ones and things from both box sets. The Knight Defender looks like it's kind of halfway between a Castellan Knight and a Dominus in terms of equipment, armed with a great big conversion beamer, a big plasma gun, and then a force field that it can use to protect itself and other knights. In game, it looks like the book printed points cost is 435 points, which if that does wind up staying the same would make it the very most expensive out of the knights in the book, though it certainly has some pretty intimidating weapons and a good invulnerable save. For its stat line it has the standard Questoris Knight one, so after the more recent digital update changes that's toughness 11, 26 wounds and a 3+ save. Most of them get a 5+ invulnerable save with their ion shields that works against ranged only, so they tend to be easier to kill in melee than at range with high AP weapons. The Defender's one is boosted up to a big 4+ though, which is really quite intimidating to play against for enemy gun batteries. It's going to be deflecting really quite a lot of las cannons and things, no need for a command point to rotate ion shields. Otherwise they move 10 inches, or at least are fairly rapid to get their firepower to bring to bear or get towards the enemy, and they'll be able to smash through walls and things with a super heavy walker keyword. One interesting change that seems to have happened for the Questoris Knights are that they've dropped down to OC8 from OC10. It seems a little bit of an odd decision to have that on their base stat lines given that the Chaos Knights are still OC10. I'm not really too sure as to their thinking of that. Maybe it's because one of the qualities can get you back to OC10. In any case, overall the Knight Defender is a slightly unusually tough Questoris to take down at range with a slightly spooky high invulnerable save. For its weapons, its primary two are Conversion Beam Obliterator and a Plasma Executor. The Conversion Beam is one of the ones that's better at sort of longer range as opposed to shorter range. If you fire it within 18 inches, it'll be 3 attacks hitting on a 3+ at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 4, and it'll have sustained hits on a D3. Though if you fire it at longer range, anywhere between 18 and 36 inches, the sustained hits all go off on a 4+, so that means that even with 3 attacks, then you're averaging really quite a lot of hits on the opponent. I believe you average around about 6 or so hits if you're using the single built-in nightly reroll as a hit roll for that. It's really quite a good general purpose profile though, plenty of strength and damage, maybe a tiny bit low AP might make it a bit less relevant against 2+ saves, though several detachments could help out by getting ignored cover. Otherwise, for the Plasma Executor, that one's a big scary plasma gun. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3 if you overcharge, dropping a bit of AP strength and damage if you don't. That's going to be a solidly dangerous one for wiping out elite infantry. Terminator equivalents and standard space marines really won't like that, and even if it's wounding on a 5, good AP and damage is still going to keep it relevant against tougher stuff. Then for small arms, it's got a kind of surprisingly weedy phosphor blaster instead of a stubber. Just the 2 small arm shots at strength 5 with ignore cover, and then a slightly boosted twin heavy flamer mounted under the conversion beamer. This one's a twin ascending combustor technically, so similar to the Mechanicus. That'll hit with D6 attacks at strength 6, AP 1, damage 1 and twin linked. I guess could be nice enough if the opponent's units are pushing up to get near this guy, or helping out a touch to burn some things down that are attacking it in melee. Finally, it's got its Titanic Feet attacks, not really too dangerous outside of a bit of chip damage. 4 attacks hitting on a 4 at strength 8, AP -1 and damage 2. Really quite tame into most things. I guess Valourstrike Lance with a Thunderstomp could make that significantly more scary though. Then finally it's got its special rules. The Questoris Knights all get a Bondsman ability, and this one is Defender's Duty. It seems to have nicked this one off the Warden as it's a good defensive buff, and Armigers affected by the Bondsman ability get a -1 to enemy damage characteristics that go against the model. I'd argue that is one of the better ones. You could use it on an Armiger Warglaive that you then push into the mid-board to stand on an objective. The opponent's going to have to do a lot more work to put it down than they normally would have to. Then its second rule is called Selfless Protector, and this is how it can use its shield generator to protect other knights if when the opponent makes a shooting attack, a friendly Imperial Knights model is at least partially obscured by this guy. The knight they're trying to target has a 4+ invulnerable save, and also gains the benefit of cover as well. I guess the idea is that you could have the Knight Defender just operating with another ranged knight alongside it, maybe a Castellan or Crusader, and then if they sort of move around next to each other, then no matter which one of them you fire at, the things are going to have a 4+ invulnerable save. It's definitely an interesting and fairly fun rule. Maybe feels a little bit counter to the idea of not wanting to put this guy on the front lines, and particularly given that its weapons want to be a bit further away. You kind of want to be 18 inches away at least for the conversion beamer and not in melee for the blast. Feels like it could be strong in really quite a big Warhammer 40k game when you've got entire phalanxes of knights wandering around. The more confined, busy terrain tables, you might not be able to put it just next door to another knight, and it might make more sense to have them going around independently, skirmishing with enemy units and taking objectives and things. It certainly feels like this guy plus another ranged knight standing next to each other could be a really intimidating damage and defensive firebase though. Seems that between the firepower and the shooting they'll put out and the defense, they'd have a pretty reasonable chance of beating down whatever tries to challenge them in a pure damage game. Overall though, certainly seems like really quite a solidly interesting datasheet. Maybe the biggest question though is whether or not it's worth the extra points increase, as at least on early points it does seem to cost really quite a lot more than the rest. Moving on to other datasheets though, and first up we have the Armigers. These guys typically cost around about 140 points or so, and are going to be the smaller and more expendable units in the army, able to do a bit of grunt work like camping objectives, doing secondaries, and perhaps being on the front line to take the brunt of the enemy first attacks before the big ones counter-attack. Like the big ones, they also had a change in their stat line from the digital update. They now have 14 wounds rather than 12, but dropped down to toughness 9, so things like strength 10 missiles and strength 9 melter will be wounding them far more easily. And they don't have quite as much OC anymore, only having 6 OC and dropping down a bit if they're degraded to 5 wounds or fewer. They're still solid units and pretty powerful within a knight army though. The Helverin is the ranged version. This one's got autocannons with 4 attacks each out to 48-inch range, all hitting at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3. Given they want to be at longer range, they usually tend to pair that with a stubber and just have some small feat attacks if they get in melee. The autocannons are a profile that's good against certain units, but high saves and high toughness both give them problems. Outside of some good support, they're maybe not quite so likely to be the main event in terms of damage, but more deal some chip damage to things. The biggest change that the datasheet had in the Codex was their special rule being replaced. Previously they had anti-fly 2+ if they were either in your deployment zone or on objectives, and that could make them weirdly good at killing certain things, perhaps particularly good for hunting Necron Catan. Instead they've swapped this out for a -1 to hit rule now. So after you've shot with this guy, you get to nominate one enemy unit that isn't a monster or vehicle that was hit by the Armiger autocannons, and until your next shooting phase they'll be -1 to hit. It could mean that enemy infantry and mounted things just aren't doing quite as much damage. That's not always the most powerful datasheet rule in the world, but given that it's on a unit that's quite good regardless of that, and you might well have say multiple copies of them in an army, you could be handing that out to quite a few enemy units and genuinely have an impact on their overall damage. Otherwise, the other major change is that the Armigers lost battle line outside of the Spearhead force, so that means that for the other detachments you can only field a max of 3 Armiger Helverins and 3 Armiger Warglaves, which I'm sure won't necessarily please people too much, given that a lot of people might well have more than that. I feel like for plenty of the other detachments at 2,000 points you wouldn't necessarily want to be spamming Armigers, and using 6 of them can still get you a fair amount on the board, though you do have less flexibility if you wanted say mass Warglaves for the front lines or mass Helverins for backfield support. Overall I still feel like it's going to be a useful unit, holding down home field objectives and chipping in at long range. Good for doing some grunt work for the army while still chipping into damage. In Valourstrike lands still missed the Squire's Duty stratagem, but seems like a bit of a standout one in the Spearhead-at-Arms. Getting efficient bondsman abilities and extra things like boosted AP or the rapid fire rule seem like really quite good things when you can access them really efficiently across multiple Armigers at once. For most detachments though, I guess they'd be fielded in a more supporting role. Otherwise, their melee counterparts are the Armiger Warglaves, generally the ones that you'd be more tempted to have moving forward to the front line to try and take down some things in the midboard, though likely getting killed in return. They attack with a thermal spear as their primary weapon, a big hitting melter weapon with 2 shots at strength 12, AP 4 and damage D6, and all with melter 4, so some serious threat if you can get within melter range. It can be quite reliable given that you've got the nightly rerolls on each model as well. It did get toned down in the recent night updates though, dropping down to 18 inches rather than the previous 24, so you would need to get quite a lot closer to use it. For its melee, it's got a fairly general purpose Reaper Chain Cleaver, 4 attacks at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3, or some sweeps for a bunch of damage 1 attacks. It still has a damage boost on the charge even if it's been shifted slightly. Previously you had sustained hits 1 on the charge, now you just have an extra attack on the strike mode or 2 extra attacks on the sweep mode. They usually mass out to be around about the same damage increase, but it means that if you have other things that can give it sustained hits, it's going to be able to be affected like those, say for the Gatekeeper defense line. Overall still seems solidly useful as knights to skirmish over the midboard objectives. If you're using a knight defender, it feels nice to have 1 or 2 around to use the -1 damage to make them tougher when they go there. Again, I strongly suspect they'll see some good play, though I guess in low numbers now, given that you're only taking 1 to 3 of them in most detachments. Next up, let's go through the other Questoris Knights, most of which haven't really changed in enormous ways. First up, we have the Knight Errant, with a big melee weapon and a big melter gun. The thermal cannon can be pretty devastating, 2d3 shots at 24-inch range, strength 12, AP 4 and damage d6, so basically an extra punchy version of the Armored Warglaves weapon, but instead of melter 4 this has got blast and melter 6, so just massively enormously more threatening when you're within 12-inch range. It also gets a boost when it targets the closest target as well, so further doubles down on that theme, hitting on a 2+ there. Otherwise, the big knight melee weapons haven't really changed too much. Either a Reaper Chainsaw that's a little bit less threatening against really tough stuff, though better against Space Marines with 12 attacks at strength 9 and damage 2. Otherwise you can use the Thunderstrike Gauntlet, that's better against tough stuff with 4 attacks at strength 20 and a huge damage 8. Isn't quite as strong against standard Space Marines, but quite nice against Terminator equivalents with 8 attacks at strength 10 and damage 3. I feel like I've seen slightly more people take the Thunderstrike over the Chainsword, though they're both solid enough. Its Bondsman ability is still re-rolling advances and giving ranged weapons the assault keyword, so potentially fast-moving shooty Armigers, pretty redundant in the Valourstrike lance, maybe not awful for a Warglaive pushing up alongside it perhaps. This did see a bit of play before. Overall it feels like a solid enough generalist, just maybe a bit all or nothing as to whether or not that melter weapon can get close and hitting the enemy hard. Next up we've got the Knight Paladin, previously 375 points and the Codex is still printed the same. This guy is basically the equivalent that gets the rapid fire battle cannon, really quite a high rate of fire weapon. If you're within 36-inch range you get 6 plus 2d6 shots, so around about 13 or so on average. They all hit home at strength 10, AP 1 and damage 3, so really quite a punchy high rate of fire. It was maybe one of the slightly more overlooked ones before, though its datasheet got a pretty nice buff. Rather than having a single reroll that often felt a little underwhelming with its mass volume attacks, it now has a rule called Seasoned Noble, and ranged attacks made by this model get better by AP-1 if they're targeting the closest eligible enemy units. That's basically exactly what the battle cannon wants. It was really quite let down by its low AP, and there's several detachments that allow you to ignore cover with it as well. So maybe as a result the battle cannon knight could be a bit more tempting. Its Bondsman ability is also rated as quite a good one. It gives your Armigers weapons lethal hits and lance, which is pretty nice both on Helverins and Warglaives. Overall, between all that, it seems solid enough. I think the battle cannon extra AP will be a big deal. I'm not sure if it's going to be enough to make it overcome the more specialist knights though. Next up, we've got the Knight Gallant, pre-Codex 375 points, printed in the Codex it's 385, though it might change. And this one's the dedicated melee knight, no enormous shooting to speak of, but boosted melee weapons. This one and all the previous Questoris do get a carapace weapon still, either the choice of an Icarus autocannon array, Ironstorm missile pods for some indirect, or a Storm Spear missile pod. Just given the damage it can do, the vast majority of people tend to go Storm Spear for this one. 3 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage d6 is at least fairly relevant both against infantry and vehicles. The Gallant's main deal is certainly melee though. It moves faster than the other Questoris at a 12-inch move, gets the full choice of either the Reaper Chainsword or the Thunderstrike Gauntlets, so can choose the exact right profile for the job. It has both of those profiles boosted in effectively 3 different ways now. First up, it hits on a 2+ rather than a 3+, which is a big damage increase. Then it has extra attacks, getting 6 attacks on the strike modes and then either 12 or 18 on the sweep modes, effectively a plus 50% compared with the other knights. And as if that weren't quite enough damage for you, in the Codex it's also picked up devastating wounds on the strike modes, so a reasonable chance to get a big hit punching through an invulnerable save. And it's also got lethal hits on the sweep modes as well, so maybe against things that you're wounding on a 3+, you're going to convert those wounds just that little bit more reliably, though I feel like that's a slightly smaller and more subtle buff. For things that you wound on a 4+ or worse, you probably want to use the strike mode anyway. Overall though, it's a nice enough increase in melee power. As a dedicated melee knight, you really want to be breaking the thing that you charge into, as it's not going to be getting value in other ways. And otherwise for special rules, it still gives your bondsmen re-rolling charge rolls and re-rolling hits in close combat. Nice enough for Warglaives I suppose. And otherwise it's had a small tweak to its datasheet rule. It's going to be even less survivable in combat unfortunately, both losing the feel no pain that knights had and also losing the -1 to hit. Instead it swapped that out for a boosted consolidation range, so in theory you could charge into something, destroy it, and then push on to tag something else. Again, that's not really the worst in the world. There's plenty of units that just can't afford to remain in melee with a knight. Overall certainly still seems interesting, and there's plenty of detachments that can increase its threat range by a more meaningful way than the Index. It could get a plus 3-inch move in Gatebreaker, it can advance and charge in the Companions one, and there's maybe got a better chance of having the movement buff active as well. So it feels like it's just going to have a bit more threat range, which it can just burst out of cover and charge into the enemy with. I still say that on paper it's probably going to struggle to overcome the Might of the Knight Lancer, which still has a whole load of damage but plenty of good benefits over the Gallant. It has its 4+ invulnerable save in melee, more wounds and a faster speed thing plus free tank shock. If the Lancer still is somewhat close to it in points value, I suspect that that'll still get taken more. Next up, we've got the Gatling Cannon Knight that is the Knight Warden. This was one of the slightly more expensive ones before at 385 points. Codex printed it's 395, and this one's got its Murderous Avenger Gatling Cannon, 18 shots at strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2, so absolutely obliterates Space Marines, and then its choice of melee weapon. For its primary datasheet rule, it still has devastating wounds on all those Avenger Gatling Cannon shots, provided it happens to be targeting things that aren't monsters or vehicles, and I guess if it's playing Valourstrike Lance, it's got very easy access to lethal hits now, which means the Gatling Cannon could still be pretty standout effective even into more tough stuff too. Again, there's a few options and enhancements in the Codex that can allow you to ignore cover. Otherwise though, it got a new Bondsman ability, given that the defender nicked its -1 damage one, and this one seems to be kind of built to lead Helverins into battle now. Weapons equipped by the model that's affected get sustained hits 1, and they also get to ignore cover at range 2. The sustained hits could help out melee Armigers, but ignores cover at range plus an already good damage boost is exactly what the Helverins want on 2 fronts, having the low AP but otherwise at least fairly generalist range firepower. It feels like it could be an interesting choice for the Spearhead-at-Arms as a result, with some absolutely murderous shooting damage. Next up, we've got the Knight Crusader, the slightly more flexible ranged knight, getting one of those very nasty Avenger Gatling cannons, and then your choice of either a battle cannon or thermal cannon in addition. Pre-Codex, this guy was 395 points, printed in the Codex at 375, though it might well change, and going into the new book, his datasheet is basically unchanged from the index. The only thing that really shifted was the weapon skill of his feats dropping down to a 4+. Just in general, it's got some pretty murderous firepower. The Gatling cannon's good, it's got its top gun, and both the battle cannon and thermal cannon are useful. Again, like the Warden, it might well really enjoy any enhancement that allows it to ignore cover, and seems to have loads from the Valourstrike Lance that could help it out. Fast movement before shooting, easy access to lethal hits, and potentially thunder stomping if it does wind up in melee. Looks like it could be interesting enough for the Gate Warden Lance as well. All the more dedicated ranged knights seem like they get on well with that one. Otherwise, for its buffing rules, it can give Armigers a +1 to hit at range. Never really a bad thing, and again that'll help out the firepower of Helverins, maybe not quite as much as the Warden's buffs do though. And if it manages to stay still for a turn and doesn't need to move around to either get to objectives or inflicts damage, you get sustained hits 1 at base on all of its weapons, so potentially can go on rage mode. If it say moves up, does some damage, the opponent moves out and tries to destroy it but falls short. Overall, given just how much support it feels like there is for ranged knights in the new codex though, it could be one to watch, even if I guess it's acquired one more rival in the Knight Defender. Next up we've got the Knight Preceptor, which is the more generic one with the Las Impulsor. Previously being one of the cheapest of the knights at 365 points, the Las Impulsor is a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. Some okay anti-tank damage with D6 strength 14, AP3 and damage 4 attacks, or trading out for some okay anti-infantry shots with 2d6 attacks at strength 7, AP1 and damage 2. This one's the knight that goes on the hunt for its quarry. At the start of the game you can choose one enemy unit and he gets 2 reroll wound rolls against it, and the Bondsman ability allows any bonded Armigers to get reroll wound rolls against that same target. Those are a couple of shifts from the index, given that previously it rerolled hit rolls, not wound rolls, and the Bondsman ability was previously to do with OC and leadership. Unless Games Workshop actually decides to make the points cost of this one quite significantly lower than the rest, I'll be very surprised to see it see any sort of regular play. The quarry rule is just a very hit and miss one. You could select something that your opponent then goes on to hide, or they might just not have any particularly great tough targets that you really care about having it on. And it means that there's multiple pathways that this knight could just basically be a very stock knight with no real other advantages other than its kind of medium jack of all trades profile. Another reason that means the Preceptor isn't really taken so much is how good Canis Rex has been. Basically, if you want a knight with the exact same equipment but hitting far harder and getting powerful free stratagems, he basically has the same sort of threat profile as the Knight Preceptor, but his damage is just far higher. He hits on a 2+ and has sustained hits 1, and while his damage isn't quite as powerful as it was in the index, as he previously had sustained hits on a 5+, it still means on average he's probably going to be having more hits than he has attacks once you've factored in nightly rerolls from the code Chivalric. Overall it means that he's still got solidly punchy damage from that Las Impulsor. Freedom's Hand is a boosted Thunderstrike gauntlet, getting 5 attacks with sustained hits and a big damage 9. It's still going to be at least somewhat giving a gallant a run for its money for best melee damage. And it's still got its fairly awesome command point manipulation rule, decreasing the cost of a stratagem. It's still printed at making a stratagem 0 CP, but the Balanced Day Slate changed it to be a discounted strat. Compared with his index version, he does sound like he's been taken down at least 1 peg. I guess with average mass, his damage output is about 85% of what it would have been previously without that sustained hits rule, and that is enough to make a meaningful difference for him. He also won't be having the 6+ feel no pain and will get other detachment benefits instead. It still seems okay though, and did gain a small special rule as a trade-off for losing the sustained hits on a 5+. He'll be able to cancel Battle Shock for one knight within 12 inches once per game. He can use that on other Imperium units as well, which is kind of fun. But I guess that means that even if he or another knight gets Battle Shocked from charging through a wall or something, you could turn that off to allow him to use Stratagems. Overall, unless he has any sorts of dramatic points increases, I still think he's going to be a strong option. Finally, for his benefits, he still has the aside of Sir Hector getting out after the knight's destroyed, basically getting out as if from a destroyed transport vehicle, and then you have a slow-moving lone operative character, who is basically there for either a bit of utility or denying the kill on Canis Rex. It means that for certain mission objectives and things where you want to destroy a certain character, it doesn't count as killed until he's down, and it could be surprisingly annoying to get rid of, given he's easy to hide and has lone operative, and none of your units are really going to want to go out the way to deal with him. Some games you're not going to lose Canis Rex at all, and some games where you do is not going to be the biggest impact in the world, but if he ever does manage to get a few victory points from a secondary mission or force the opponents to divert some extra units to go and deal with him, then so much the better. It's kind of interesting that he kept his leadership 5+ when Canis Rex dropped down to 6+ from 5. Maybe a little bit surprising that he seems to be a bit braver when he's out of his knight suit. Finally, for units in the mainline codex, we've got the Knight Castellan and Valiant, the Dominus Knights. They had really quite a big stats rewrite when they had their digital update recently, dropping down to toughness 12 and a 3+ save, so got a bit more of a flat downgrade versus the rest, given that the 2+ save made them really quite sturdy before. There's two classes of the Knight Dominus, the Castellan and the Valiant. They're both really quite slow, with limited movement range at 8 inches, and not so much melee threat with their titanic feet. In particular, the Castellan really doesn't want to get into close combat if it can avoid it. For secondary weapons, they get some twin melter guns mounted on the chassis, and then a choice of either some shield breaker missiles or twin siege breaker cannons on the carapace guns, depending on whether or not you want a bit more volume fire or just a few more really quite punchy, devastating anti-tank hits. Finally, for their common points, they both provide an aura of cover to Armiger models nearby. Maybe not the worst buff in the world and could give them a bit more positioning freedom, though it's not really the hardest thing to get in 10th edition 40k, and sometimes it won't make a difference against things that have got highish AP, as they're going to hit the ion shields either way. For differences though, the Knight Castellan has generally been the stronger one in 10th edition, and that's the great big gun turret variant. It gets a pretty enormous and general purpose plasma decimator, D6+3 shots at strength 9, boosted to AP-4 now with damage 3, presuming you overcharge. That's pretty murderous for taking down enemy elite infantry, and it's certainly a profile that might appreciate some easy access lethal hits from the Valourstrike lance. That'll make it a lot more stand out against tough stuff. Otherwise though, it's got its mighty Volcano lance, D3 shots or at a big strength 18, AP-5, and a crazy damage D6+8. So any shot that goes through has got a pretty reasonable chance of just one-shotting an enemy battle tank, and with that many shots with the nightly rerolls built in, there's a pretty reasonable chance that you're going to get at least one. Finally, for its special rule, it's had a small buff to that as well. Each time a ranged attack made by this model is allocated to a monster or vehicle model, you can re-roll the damage roll if you want to. Previously you could only re-roll damage rolls of 1, but now you've got a bit more flexibility. That's pretty handy to have if, say, the Volcano Lance rolls a 2 and, say, just falls short by 1 wound or something of destroying an enemy vehicle, and you could have a pretty reasonable chance just to one-shot it if you roll once more. It'd also be helpful for shield breaker missiles. Overall, it's still got a pretty terrifying stack of guns. As mentioned in some of the previous detachments, it does look like there's an awful lot of things that can help out ranged knights in this codex. Valourstrike Lance will be very nice for fast movement to get lines of sight where it needs to, lethal hits as an easy pop-up for the plasma, and maybe even Thunderstomp so it's not completely useless in melee. It's still going to be weak to being tagged there though. There's multiple detachments that can give ignore cover. You could get a +1 to hit and wound from the Questoris companions, and there's easy sustained hits on offer from the Gatebreaker one, which seems really nice on all these mixed profiles. Again, could be one to watch, though it certainly has rivalry in the ranged knight capacity, both the Crusader and Defender also looking interesting still. Finally, we've got its flamer-wielding brother-in-arms that is the Knight Valiant. This one's the close-range Dominus Knight, and unfortunately it's tended to have a lot less of a good time in 10th edition so far. The primary weapons for this one are a conflagration cannon, so 3d6 hits at strength 8, AP1 and damage 2, with torrent and ignores cover. That's pretty brutal to sort of medium infantry units, though it isn't going to do crazy amounts to really tough stuff. Far more scary is its Thundercoil Harpoon. That one's changed in profile kind of similar to how the Knight Tyrant did for the Chaos Knights. It's got a shorter range down to 12 inches, has dropped down from damage 12 to damage 10, and it's lost the anti-keywords that allowed it to punch devastating wounds through really easily. But on the flip side, it has actually got a big damage boost as well, getting D3 shots on its attack profile rather than 1, and also the blast keyword, so it might be a bit more punchy against heavy infantry. What's more, it's also gained an extra special rule as well. Thundershock means that you roll a dice for its target unit with the Thundercoil Harpoon, and then every other enemy unit within 6 inches. On a 4+, they take D3 mortal wounds from arcing energies. Overall, it's a bit of a weird weapon. It feels like really quite a power trip to fire, and certainly is a big scary threat. It's just really limited by how short its range is at 12 inches, and also that it's got the blast keyword, so you can't fire it if you're tagged in melee, which definitely isn't ideal for a big scary knight that really needs to push up the board and get close to get value from its weapons. I'm not sure this was necessarily a good change overall, to be honest. I feel like they probably should have kept the Thundercoil Harpoon at 18 inches at least. As a result, I'd still probably expect to see more Castellans than Valiants on the board if you're taking big shooty knights. That's it for the Codex ones. They're worth just mentioning the Imperial Armour Knights as well. It would be nice if Games Workshop actually put them in the Codex and made them a more core part of the Imperial Knight army, but it seems that they still want to be branding them for the Horus Heresy at the moment. At least in 10th edition though, it still looks like they're going to remain fully playable both in competitive and casual games. In recent times, the more standout ones have been the Sevastus Knight Lancer, with its big melee damage, fast movement, and big invulnerable save in close combat. And then the Sevastus Knight Atropos, again fast moving, getting an invulnerable save in melee, plus having some really quite nice anti-tank and vehicle weapons, and a pretty good general purpose threat. I guess there might be some sort of further errata to these guys. If the rest of the Imperial Knights have got OC 8, I'd probably guess they're going to drop the OC of these guys down to 8 as well. It still feels like, unless points change in a big way, the Lancer and the Atropos will be the ones to look at most. I wonder if people might be a bit more tempted by the Armiger Moirax as well if other Armigers are limited. Maybe they could see a bit of value from the Spearhead-at-Arms, though potentially might still struggle to break through given a lot of those buffs being really quite nice on the Helverins. In any case, certainly looks like there's some scary stuff and interesting options for the Knights out there. Certainly feels like they're still going to be solidly strong after this, unless they decide to raise points a fair bit higher. For overall impressions, the core army rule maybe looks just a little bit more interesting than before. Given a big focus on movement in other detachments, maybe there could be some draw to taking the movement one over the rerolls, though I still suspect that that one's probably going to be the main one. For the detachments, I'd say that every single one of them is at least interesting. I'd probably still guess that the fast-moving and pretty efficient stratagems of the Valourstrike Lance might be the one that leads the way for most people, given the buffs can apply to a lot of things, but literally all the rest have good stuff. Questoris companions maybe with 2 quads on the go, some good enhancements, advance and charge, and OC5 sticky objectives. Gatebreaker Lance with an enormous amount of damage moves, but with a big caveat that it's going to be awkward to position the knights on the board quite so well. And then the Spearhead-at-Arms, which I probably guess isn't going to be the single strongest one, just due to the current efficiency of Armigers and synergies breaking down fast once you start losing models. But I certainly might be wrong on that, and you can certainly make some enormously efficient Helverin shooting batteries if you can get them all in on one key target. Data sheets wise, there hasn't really been as many changes as certain codex updates. I guess we got quite a lot of the more major stuff in the digital update with the stat line changes, and as we've seen, that's still been pretty conducive to the knights doing well. I guess lacking 6+ feel no pain will mean they're not going to be quite so indomitable as they were before, but at least a few of the detachments might have made them a bit more deadly to make up for that. I say most of the knight variants still seem interesting enough. I still probably guess that the Gallant, the Preceptor and the Valiant are going to be rather overshadowed compared with some. And I wouldn't be too surprised to see some of the shooting variant knights in pride of place, just given how many detachments support them rather well. Let me know your thoughts on the Knightly Codex though. What do you make of it, and what would you be tempted to put on the board? I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. I'll leave that one there for now though. As mentioned, a big thank you to Toy Snowman for sponsoring the video. If you're looking to pick up some new knights or Warhammer 40k stuff in general, they have it at 15% discount in Canada. There's all the other channel's affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description as well though if you're looking to pick up some knights. Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Taschengeldieb in Germany and the EU for between 16 and 20. As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to anyone picking stuff up through those links. If you do happen to buy something in, it does help to support Auspex Tactics. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.